Natalie. I'm Anne-Marie. I'm an ecologist in land resources. And Natalie is a research ecologist with USDA ARS in Sydney, Montana. Dr. West studies weed population and community dynamics and biocontrol impacts in a number of different systems. Prior to moving to Sydney, Natalie was a postdoc with the USDA ARS in Urbana, Illinois, researching invasion risks and management of perennial crops. Before that, she got a master's in plant biology from Southern Illinois University Carbondale and a PhD from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where her graduate work examined plant-insect interactions in native thistles and the ecology of exotic species in forest opening communities. I had the pleasure a little over 2 years ago to start working with Natalie on a truly interdisciplinary project looking at the hydrogeomorphic controls of Retinol of invasions in a floodplain river system. And I think Natalie's going to touch on a few of those results today. But for me, it's been a tremendous joy and a lot of fun to work with Natalie. She has an exceptional ability to place quantitative ecology in the realm of ecological theory. And Natalie is the only person I know who can seamlessly transition from discussing complex ecological theory to some hilarious adaptations of Saturday Night Live sketches, incorporating terms such as hydrochory, lipidium, and biocontrol. And so with that, I give you Natalie West.
I didn't have time to work up my materials, so you'll have to wait for that one, the next one. So thanks very much. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for that very generous introduction. I'm happy to be here, and I heard this is a rough cut seminar, so I'm going to hold you to that. And yeah, so let's get started. So as Anne-Marie said, I am a research ecologist with the Agricultural Research Service in Sydney, Montana. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about what I do, but I heard one of your main topic areas this semester were grasslands, so I thought I would talk a little bit about what I did, but then talk about two really collaborative projects that we have going on in Eastern Montana among the scientists at Sydney and other ARS locations that really touch on a lot of different aspects of trophic dynamics in grassland communities. So I'll talk about trophic interactions and management, like why we should care and basically what I do. I'm not going to say why I care because that sounds cynical. And then two grassland case studies, one in which invasive plant management with Russian olive removal along the Yellowstone River, as well as a rangeland reclamation in response to incorporating the dynamics of energy development in the Bakken oil region. And then I'll talk briefly, if I have time, about what's up next. Maybe you'll hear about what Anne-Marie and I and Jeff are working on. So first things first. Where is Sydney? Just in case you don't know. I actually had to look this up, and I found out my congressional district too. So here's Bozeman. Follow that Yellowstone River up to the other black thing. So Sydney is here. It is the crossroads and gateway to North Dakota. And it is grasslands, basically. And the ARS lab in Sydney is a group of pretty collaborative scientists. We're a small group, but we work on pest management and agricultural methods for integrated pest management. And so our emphasis is really biological and cultural controls. We're looking to minimize the use of chemical methods, and ARS themselves is a leader in integrated pest management with alternatives to chemicals or using chemicals within an integrated framework. So we think a lot about how you can modify ecological interactions to really preserve and promote the sustainability of systems in the West. So the thing that we're always thinking about is how both pests and management are imposing disturbances. And it really they'll both invasions, in my case, maybe if crop pests or whatever, disrupts and can reorder the assembly of communities. And so the big question we are always asking ourselves is, what is the community we want to see in any given situation? And then what are the successive or interacting management goals? We are a government agency, and our mission is to develop sustainable long-term solutions to key agricultural problems, and specifically ones that are very intractable. So in rangelands, You have a lot of area, you have a lot of areas that are not easy to get to or manage. So we think a lot about those kinds of alternative systems. So there's a real consequence to really understanding these ecological dynamics. So we think about invasive species control, soil health, interim species, what do you want in the meantime? What's the succession going to bring you? How are you creating wildlife habitat? And these expectations and goals will shift through time. So that's just a general what we're thinking about. And when you're really assessing these impacts of these different pest species, you're really thinking a lot about interactions in time and space. The temporal scales over which most management can consistently operate is fairly small within an ecological time frame. And so invasions, removals, reclamations, all these things are happening in long time periods for us, but relatively short time periods for communities. So we can detect emerging community effects, but the long-term effects and the large-scale effects of these are often hard to tease apart. How consistent are the patterns that we see? How do these results inform management goals and research needs? Really needs us to think about how all these different coexisting parts are working together. So this is what I'm going to argue for. We need this multi-trophic approach, and this is kind of the context in which many of us work within the Sydney location. We're looking at potential variation, is it recovery rates or management rates, if it's a weed problem, and we're looking at how interactions and their effects affect the functional communities. All good so far, hopefully. So that's a little bit about why we care about multi-trophic interactions. So what do? Well, I'm in general interested in weeds, all things weedy. I like weeds. Weeds. And in biocontrol is one of the main mission areas that I work on, and really that's really exploiting ecological interactions to control weeds. So many of the management tools, and particularly when we think about integrated pest management, we're thinking about things that are emulating ecological stressors that plants, in my case, I'm always going to talk about weeds, so I apologize, are reacting to. And so multiple stressors are always interacting to limit the persistence and spread of weeds. And the influence of these stressors vary in time and space. Sure. The big controversy, of course, in insects is whether insect top-down control has a control, like when it happens and in what context it happens. And this can be a really touchy subject. People argue about this, but when biological control is successful, it can be a cost-effective and long-term solution in weed management. But success really depends on proper deployment and combinations of the tools you use. So a lot of what I do is about why plants occur what they do, and whether insects are having effects on them. So for instance, some of the things I work on in white top, which is a weed in the West, and there's some people here who are very familiar with white top. Think about, one of the things I'm interested in is the seed or clonal spread vary with habitat, and this can be really important when thinking about if insect effects are going to have any long-term implications. And so I look at various habitats, clonal spread, then I'll do experiments where I'm looking at really planting weed patches and seeing if insects are having implications. This is my new long-term common garden experiment. I also am interested in looking at older biocontrol systems, such as leafy spurge, which is one of our great flagship biocontrol efforts, where we've had very successful agents, but success over time and space has been variable. And there's significant knowledge gaps still in the weed ecology, but also in the genetics, because early on we didn't really understand which manifestations of euphorbia were actually invading North America. Now that we have the tools to detect these, we can better understand how biological control can be integrated with other strategies and be implemented to fill management gaps. So those are some of the sort of tritrophic, multitrophic interactions that I'm thinking about a lot of times. But that's just me. I said I'd talk about grasslands. So I'm going to talk about our two grassland case studies within the ARS, mostly ARS folks working on it. And the first is going to be the invasive plant management and Retinol. Does everyone know what Retinol is? It's very common in the West. So most of my pictures will have it there in some form. So Russian olive, of course, is a community member, is a major structural element. It's a big shrub. It creates closed canopies with little understory, and it's really been increasing on our waterways. It's now one of the major, the main shrubs detected along Western rivers. And so there's interest in not only controlling it, but also what should come after it, because it's a major structural component. You remove it, and so then you're like, what do I want to come back? What do I want to come after it? So if you're removing weeds, which a lot of people want to do along these riparian corridors, right, regeneration can restore desirable ecosystems, though you can have a lot of problems with secondary invasions, regeneration. So it's a long-term investment. We don't know, though, is how some of these control methods, not only are we worried about the plant invasions, but once we start removing these major structural elements, how is this affecting other communities that maybe we're interested in? One of the primary lovers of Russian olive are pheasant hunters, right? That's supposedly wildlife, good habitat for pheasants. There's a lot of other bird people who are interested in Russian olive. So really thinking about how insect communities are going to respond to not only Russian olive, but also to its removal has important implications as we begin to think about what our management goals should be. So we did this project in collaboration with scientists at Miles City, the Fort Keogh ARS station. And so we have the two intersecting points of Sydney and Bozeman, and then Miles City's right sandwiched between those two, if you don't know, right along the Yellowstone River. And so what we've done is we've created a long-term removal experiment in which we have removed Russian olive. We've begun revegetating some of those areas, and through time, we're going to monitor these areas and begin to increasingly remove more and more of the Russian olive cover along the Yellowstone at Fort Keogh. And we're going to track reassembly in both plants and insects. We've been doing this. And so the plots were removed, the trees were removed in 2011. And so we've been tracking vegetation change through time. And so this is some of the early results from the 5-year surveys, where you can see that basically we removed Russian olive, all but 2 of the species that we tried to reestablished. Survival improves over time. The only thing that really crashed was narrowleaf cottonwoods. So we're getting pretty good tree and shrub resurgence. Native grasses and the seeded species that we put in have also been increasing. Also, so did annual bromes. That shouldn't be a surprise in eastern Montana because brome is everywhere. But we do get more invasive perennial grass cover in our unrevegetated controls. So you can see here that actually revegetating is helping us minimize our invasive weeds. Non-native forbs are decreasing through time, but we'll see what happens as the floods carry through the future. I'm not sure how well that's going to do, but we'll see. So I'm kind of talking quickly through this because the point is that we've removed Russian olive and we've put vegetation back on there. The restorations have established. We've had nuanced community responses. You do have secondary invasions happening. So we've taken these major structural elements out, we've put something else back in, we've changed the vegetative community. And so the question that I'm leading into then is, what about the arthropods? That's the data set we know very little about, and very little is known about this in general, because it's a time-intensive and difficult thing to study, these full communities. So I'm going to give you 2 kind of preliminary results. One, the paper is hopefully going to be submitted this week, on the short-term effects, which is within the first 2 years after removal. And then I can tell you a little bit about what the 5-year mark is looking like. So remember, we've had removal, we've had revegetation. We have different communities. And what we actually see is that in the short term, within 2 years after the removal, you can see that we do see a divergence in the insect communities. So these are pre-removal data in 2010. You can see these are different removal blocks. And then in 2013, you see not only greater variability within the blocks, but you also see a divergence between what are reference blocks, where we've left Russian olive in, and blocks where we've removed Russian olive, which are the black ones. So over time, we do see a divergence in the insect community and a greater variability. This is kind of expected because we've increased the heterogeneity in the environment, and so we should also see increased heterogeneity in the insect communities. But these are fairly small scale, so we weren't really sure if we would be able to detect them in the small scale in the early stages. You do see a change in prevalence of orders with time since removal in the 2 years post removal. So these are 2010 data. You can see these are all Russian olive plots. They look very similar. In 2013, these are our removal plots. So you can see you have a turnover in not only some of these white guys, which are spiders, but also a change in the prevalence of dipterans to hemipterans. So you're seeing a little bit of a change over the prevalence of some of these orders. And so what does this look like? I know you can't see this table. I'm not asking you to. What you actually should see from here, though, and I did check, it is blue and gold, right? I had a fear this morning that I was like supposed to be maroon, but this is Kentucky Wildcats to me. But you can see here, these are 2010 plots on the left side. Oh, and you can see these are all Russian olive plots, and so you can see a prevalence of dipterans here, and a few hemipterans. And then in 2013, what you can see is you had spiders come in. So you have particular mesh weavers are our most responsive group so far. And you also have a decrease in the dipterans and a pretty big increase in both richness and abundance of hemipterans. So the kind of standout families in these analyses have been, I'm not good at insect names, so you can read them on the board. But you have mesh weavers in the spiders, which should like herbaceous vegetation. You see mosquitoes coming, kind of keeping residence in the Russian olive after removal, and that's kind of expected. They like to hang out and sit on shrubs and wait around. In the hemipterans, I'm not really sure what's going on. It's an incredibly diverse group, though, so I would assume that they would probably have some shifts of some sort in different functional groups. What this means functionally, we're not 100% sure, but these were just early transient dynamics after removal. So that's 2013. That was like 2 years after removal. So we just did our second sampling in 2016, which was our 5-year post-removal mark. And so at this point, we're beginning to see the vegetation changes that I'd indicated. So we can begin to think about how not only removal, but also revegetation treatments might be influencing insects. So these are very laborious data, and so I do not have the functional breakdowns because it's actually a lot more complex in 2016. What we see are a greater abundance of insects, a higher diversity of insects over time, and how to tease apart removal effects from treatment effects. We're still working on that. So I'm just going to give you the broad overview here. At the 5-year mark, removals, which are in the light blue or in the circles, are still different than our reference plots. Russian olive plots are still different from our removal plots. So our removal plots we're still seeing a signature of management within these communities. We're not seeing a strong difference among the treatments, but 5 years isn't a lot for a vegetation treatment. That's like the minimum you need to detect vegetation change. So we're seeing more variability within the treatments. We see a lot of variability among blocks. And you're still seeing that same signature of Russian olive has a fairly restricted subset of the community, and the blocks themselves are pretty diverse. You don't actually see mean differences in richness and diversity because these are fairly small, occurring at fairly small spatial scales. So our plots are about a half an acre or so. So you wouldn't, these insects can probably move fairly freely through space. And so we see removal does relate to shifts in community structure. The ranks in abundance change, richness doesn't change much. You do see shifts in community subsets with potentially, they could have functional implications, but we really are only now starting to be able to tease that apart. Changes in structure over time do increase variability among the plots, which is interesting and should potentially be interesting to think about how those transient dynamics are going to affect the long-term trajectories. So that is our Russian olive plots. So in the short term at the local scales, we see some shifts in communities after 5 years, but our impacts are still emerging, and we continue to monitor these plots. And it takes a long time to get rid of Russian olive. So we're consistently actively managing these plots to exclude Russian olive. And as I said, we continue to remove Russian olive from around these plots. So we're actually also changing the larger landscape structure. So kind of our future plans, then we have data on removals versus reference plots in multiple other locations that we're going to compare those our general removal effects to other locations in the Western US. And then we're interested then in taking this forward to think about how these results may inform management goals. There's a lot of interest, as I said, about bird habitat within Russian olive. So what are the insect groups that we see, and are some of the concomitant changes in removal actually going to affect wildlife habitat quality? I'm hoping to find some wildlife collaborators who want to do that, because I don't know anything about birds. So, except they're insects. They eat insects. And more broadly, I am a biocontrol scientist, and there are potential biocontrol agents being developed for Russian olive. So these are not targeted to remove shrubs, they're targeted to reduce flowering and seed production. So there's a lot of questions to be asked: how they fit into resident communities, what the potential demographic impacts will be, and how this will affect interaction. So I have a multitude of other projects going on, or hoping or planning to do within the next few years on this particular question that's really going to integrate in with these insect communities. All good? I'm rushing through. So there's Russian olive. So let's talk about rangeland reclamation and the energy footprint in the Bakken region. So just because I'm in Western Montana, we're going now even further east, across the threshold of Montana, into the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota. So see here, this is kind of a cartoon extent. Here's Sydney, and here's the main oil production areas. So this has been a really important question for us close to home. We have a lot of grasslands. There's a lot of drilling that goes on within public grasslands. And so it's been a discussion about whether this increased patchwork of disturbance is creating, has a broader scale implication on invasion routes and the health of the rangelands within this region. So you can see here, here's Dickinson down here. This is kind of where Teddy Roosevelt, the southern unit of Teddy Roosevelt National Park is. Here's a north region, and I'm giving you that because in reference to this, which is a drilling map of the area. Here's Teddy Roosevelt north and south units, and these little dots are all wells. So you can see it's extremely large impact in these systems. Green ones are active wells, yellow ones have been capped. So basically we have not only the disturbance of wells and well pumping going on, but we also through time have wells that are being reclaimed interimly. So when they pump a well, when they dig a well, they actually have interim reclamation. And then once they cap the well, they take everything out and then fully restore it for the long term. So you have heavy development in the region, and we're interested in how this is affecting different communities within these grasslands. And so we know that communities are collections of different species. Assemblies, there's a collection of species that get there, and there can be a lot of different forces that are both actively encouraging assembly and a lot of neutral things that go on. So when we're talking about the Bakken oil region, we're talking about there's a lot of active reclamation going on. Like we're trying to impose particular communities that's legally mandated. Whether that is addressing management goals of sustainable ecosystems is another question. We try to do the best. They do the best they can, but it's a really difficult system to work in. So I'm not going to talk about all aspects of this sort of collection of studies. I'm just going to touch on some of the things that we've been doing. And so we've been working both in young restorations, which is these interim restorations that while the well is still active, they have to put their reclaiming part of the footprint. So what you do here is you have seeding, you have different cover crops that we can try to improve grassland reassembly in these areas. And then because this region has been pumping for a long time, the last oil boom before this was in the 70s, we actually have quite a few mature restorations, which we can look at and assess the impacts that we see in the young reclamations over the long term, and whether that actually, what do the trajectories look like over time in the region? And do any differences we see persist through time and have implications for other trophic communities? So I'm not going to talk about our early stuff, but we have, as I said, a lot of different experiments going. We've looked at vegetative cover crops. Seed mix doesn't seem to matter much. You have differences with establishment using maybe different cover crops. So some of that's sort of the stuff we do. But the biggest problem in the Bakken oil region is that there's major ecological factors within the natural environment that limit establishment. So soil differences are really important. In the grasslands in eastern Montana and North Dakota, they have very concentrated soil layers. So when you disturb the soil for drilling purposes, they'll stockpile the soil and they'll mix up this salty layer. And so when they redistribute it, often you really have fundamentally different soils. You have a lot of problems then with salty soils and weird soil chemistry. So that's really your biggest problem. There's only so much you can do with seed mixes and cover crops if your base layer is already a little difficult. And there's different ways that we can deal with this. We've had a restoration ecologist working on this. But the big thing to take from it is that plants per meter square when you restore stuff are somewhat reduced when you have really salty soils as opposed to less salty soils. But over time, what we've found is that these are some of our first year reclamations on the top. So you can say that's right after they seed, maybe like the fall after they seed those reclamations. It's pretty patchy, you get a lot of weeds. So I don't know if you can see all the kochia, it's there, like right? But by the third year, these same reclamations, we can go back and we are getting vegetation cover. So a lot of the species they choose to plant should be tolerant of this area. So they're gonna be all right. You know, you're going to see establishment, you're not gonna see some chemical wasteland. But the question then becomes, what is the community that you're getting? And how is that affecting the other trophic levels and functional groups that are really key to reintroducing a sustainable functional system? So what I'm going to spend my remaining time on are these mature restorations. And so this is a large multi-year project that we've been working on in Sydney, and about everyone in my unit has a part in it. And we just had a postdoc that finished with us who was really very quantitative, and so he took and studied nematodes. So he has brought all new trophic levels into our little community. So things that we're interested in is whether differences persist through time and affect other communities. So we can ask, do restorations or reclamations begin to resemble the surrounding landscape? And do any differences in vegetation relate to differences in other communities? The main active management is always going to be on the plant community, and that's how reclamation is assessed. What we want to know is that enough to help us really understand what the functional assemblies are, which then will feed back into our management goals. So is there a lasting footprint of development? What I'm going to talk about is a subset of the vast data set that we're accruing over time, because we're government scientists and we can do the low impact, boring questions that take a long time. So we basically selected 15 sites that were remote from active disturbance. So they had to be buffered at least 200 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 200 kilometers, considerable distance from actual new and active disturbances. So these are reclamations that should not have other disturbances affecting them. And we surveyed 3 areas per site. We looked at the restored pad, we looked at 50 meters from the restored pad, and then 150 meters from the restored pad to see, is there a difference? Do we see some sort of footprint not only on the pad, but bleeding maybe off the pad into the surrounding landscapes? So are pads similar to their surroundings, and how do they differ? So as I said, the main questions that I'm going to address, the data I'll talk about are whether reclamation efforts successfully assemble plant communities, how are soil and physical chemical factors influenced by this development and reclamation. So are we seeing similar soil impacts through time that we see in the young reclamations? And do communities of other organisms also recover or follow similar trajectories as the plant community? So I'm going to talk about the baseline results on nematodes, which are soil biota, grasshoppers, which is the main herbivore in the grasslands. And our grasshopper ecologists always make sure you have to know that there are more grasshoppers in biomass than cows in the Great Plains. And then spiders represent the next trophic level. That's a predator group. But it's also then a trophic, another bird food sort of thing. So here's some lovely pictures that I like to show. Our nematodes, we talk about not only, we've grouped them into functional groups at this stage because the taxonomy is really diverse. And so we're interested in whether nematodes are recovering functionally because we know that the soils are weird. And then we have grasshoppers, which are, as I said, the main herbivores, and spiders. So we think that when we were going into this, we thought that plant communities should differ between reclaimed well sites and intact prairie. I mean, these are pretty harsh disturbances. And what we see in the early reclamations is you do get cover, but you don't always get a compositional similarity with surrounding landscapes. You get greater bare ground and more weeds on wade pads. That's what we expected. We expected soil conditions, of course, to differ. We thought that nematode communities, because they're in the soil, should mirror any soil impacts and also then kind of follow the plant community impacts. And then in terms of the higher trophic levels, the grasshoppers and the spider communities, they should mirror plants and soils, but they may also be affecting each other. So that then you're getting into prey abundance sort of cycles through time. All right, results. Plants. Former pads still had plant communities different from the surrounding the landscape. And so if you look here, we had restorations that ranged from like 3 years to 30 years. And so basically you have these different communities. Oil pads retain a kind of a different sort of composition than their surrounding landscape. And what are the differences here? What you can see is there's actually still lower native plant richness, greater exotic plant richness. I think those are native forbs over there. You get more bare ground by transect, grass cover is lower, and the forb cover is kind of negligible. So you actually do see a lasting, persistent footprint of this disturbance. But the thing that you don't see, if you look at here, is a difference between the 50 and the 150. There doesn't seem to be, at the level that we've measured, a spillover effect from this different community. From the greater, for instance, exotic plants into the surrounding prairies, it's not necessarily causing, there's not evidence to suggest at this point that that's happening. And so when we looked at plant indicator species analysis, we do see similar patterns. So on the top, you see threadleaf sage and blue grama. These are two common prairie species in the area, and you see they're pretty low on the pad, but you do see more crested wheatgrass and inland saltgrass, which is a salt-tolerant native, disproportionately represented in these oil pad communities. Okay, plants. So soils then are still a problem, actually. This shouldn't surprise you, seeing the inland saltgrass. We still see increased sodium, as well as some other weird signatures. So these soil kind of stockpilings, mixing things are having a disproportionate impact through time. But the interesting thing is that nematodes don't seem to care very much. Like, we don't actually see a difference related to pad structure with and these weird soils in nematode functional groups. Now, this is a fairly low taxonomic resolution, but and there's some kind of weak associations between, for instance, bacterivorous nematodes and the amount of bare ground you have. But overall, we don't see an impact in the soil biotic community. And so that's interesting because soils are weird and plants aren't doing as well, but nematodes functionally are doing all right. Arthropods, however, are doing okay. And it depends on who you're talking about. So grasshoppers, I said, are important herbivores. If we look at an NMDS of the different communities, these, I don't know if you can, everyone see these. These are 150, 50, and reclaimed oil pads are the yellow boxes. Everything else is not oil pad. And so you can see that grasshoppers, you actually see, you still see their preference is somewhat different in the oil pads versus the surrounding communities when we sample these guys. And this isn't related necessarily to age. You can see here the grasshopper, this difference pattern is not influenced very much by age of the pad. Like grasshoppers are still a little bit different. And what we see if we kind of tease these apart is that you see somewhat of a decrease in forb feeders on pads, negligible effects on grass feeders, little increase in mixed feeders, but you see an increase in crop pests, which is truthfully driven by one species of crop pest. But it's interesting if they're using pads differentially, even when they're at different ages. So this is an interesting impact that maybe we hadn't really thought about. Maybe other people had thought about. I hadn't thought about it. But you can have actually, the constituents did vary and potential crop pests were more frequent on pads. So that is one potential impact that this disturbance may be having in the larger landscape. But we need more data on that. Spiders, however, there's no strong differences. You don't really see a response to vegetation the way I might have thought they would after the removal experiments. There's just maybe not enough difference. But also it could be we're not sampling the right ways, or we might not have broken it down to the sufficient taxonomic resolution. And that's always the problem with these data on how far down. It's like a trade-off between how much time you're going to spend and how much detail do you need. And so, but maybe they just don't care. I don't know, spiders. But we continue to work on these things. Spiders, these guys were we sampled not only sweeps, but also pitfalls. So we should have picked up quite a substantial representation of the community. And I should have said that in all of these systems that I'm talking about, we have multiple strata. You can ask me about that later. Malaise traps, and pitfalls, and sweeps, mostly sweeps. So we have several possible outcomes of reclamation. And it's hard to predict how that's going to occur, how that's going to play out over time, and over time whether some of these impacts will fade. What we found is that mature restorations do sort of begin to resemble the surrounding landscape, depending on the trophic levels you're interested in, but they're not really fully becoming at least within the 30-year time frame of that we were able to study. They're not quite there yet. And so these differences in vegetation do relate to differences in other communities, but it's somewhat also a nuanced response and depends on the group that you're interested in. And then it will be determined by the management goals that you have in mind. So that's the Bakken oil region. What's coming up next? Well, in Bakken, we're doing everything. Just kidding. No, but seriously. This is a large-scale project. And so we're really trying to tease apart some of the interactions in these dynamics. But this is not a real thing. This is us trying to think through how these things working. I don't know if it'll ever make sense. But we're keeping to work on the Bakken. We still are continue to work on this Retinol removal and regeneration project. What I said is that it is hard. It's a long-term investment in removing Retinol because, as you can see, you can have a lot of regeneration over time, and this is affected by dispersal from the river and also massing with trees. There's all kinds of things. So regeneration potential persists. And since I have a minute, I could tell you a little bit about one slide about what then Anne-Marie and Jeff and I are talking about is how can we relate Retinol cover with riverine fluvial dynamics? Is that a word? Is that a phrase, or did I just make that up? So, so one thing that's kind of coming out of that work is to suggest that there's particular inundation frequencies that are highly correlated with a vast majority of the cover in Russian olive. So you can see within the 5 to 10, if you incorporate any areas that get an inundation frequency of about 10 years, you're getting about 90% of the Russian olive cover. So these are not only 10-year-old populations, of course. The Russian olive is long-lived, and it's probably came in the 50s, is very likely. But it's highly overrepresented in these small-scale inundation frequencies. So the thing that we're kind of working on, and I'm thinking through, is what does this tell us about the importance of dispersal in established conditions? How is this going to inform how we think about Russian olive management and demography through time? Particularly, how does this interact with plant demography to determine prevalence when we're talking about the Russian olive insect, biocontrol insect? We're talking about a fruit feeder, right? We're talking about limiting seed dispersal, and how much is that actually going to matter if other dynamics are more important? And so, and one thing that the Sydney group has shown before is that you can have crashes in the Russian olive fruiting. Like some years, some areas are fruiting, some years are not. So there's a lot of complicated dynamics going on. And there's other projects, but I think I have run you through the full gamut. So with that, I could take any questions. And a lot of this is done in collaboration with other ARS units and other university and government collaborators. The Federated Tribes in the Fort Berthold Reservation have been very good with working with us, as well as WPX Energy puts our treatments on for the reclamation experiment, which is awesome, but also logistically a nightmare. It is funded by the BLM and ARS-based funding, so it's your tax dollars at work. And just as a note, we are hiring, if I haven't told you how awesome Sydney is, if you ever wanted to spend a couple winters on the Canadian border, this is your chance. So tomorrow an ad goes out for a postdoc position in our lab. We also always hire seasonal technicians both in the summer and winter. So we have housing on site. You don't have to pay $1,500 for one bedroom apartment in Sydney, Montana. And John's address is covered up. He's got the postdoc ads, but you can also email me. So with that, that's my rough cut seminar. Any questions? Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the soil mixing issue? I'm a human geographer, but
okay.
Reclamation from human dimensions. And landowners are really aware of that, and they really notice when energy comes their soil.
Yeah.
So, but I'm also a little confused about what's going on there. It sounds like my expectation would be that there's some really solid things.
Yeah.
And so, can you just talk a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the soil, there's and it's kind of a variable depth depending on the actual content of the soil, but the salt will matriculate down to a particular layer, a concentrated layer. And if you scrape it too deep, you're going to pick up that layer. But it's also kind of hard to avoid if you're not careful, and even if you're careful. So there's but I don't know how easy it is at the level to actually work with that at the level that they're doing. And so basically what they do is they come over with these big machines and they try and avoid the salt layer, but you can't really not. And then they stockpile it all, push it all into a big pile, and then it sits there for however long it takes them to reclaim it, which they have a few years, right? And then they'll smooth part of it back over when they do an interim reclamation. So that at that point you get a little bit of mixing. But then in stockpiling you get mixing as well, and then you still have more kind of have this kind of going back and forth. Yes, Lisa.
So in Montana, you have to keep the levels, the layers separate.
Yeah, so you do have to stockpile topsoil separate from the subsoil. North Dakota. Yeah, I believe they do have to keep the subsoil and the topsoil separate, but it's whether the salt layers it's still, yeah, it's still not sure. It's not there's not a perfect solution to that.
They can be there for a year, but they can be there for 20 years.
Exactly, and then you have the soil leaching, so maybe you got only part of it, but it's already going to leach down. And there's been discussions about whether then it would be better to plant shrubs or something that's going to cause the salt to move down to the salt faster than grasses might, but that takes a long time too. I don't know if does that answer your question? I mean, it's really about how you mix and the limitations of how well they can actually avoid salting their soils. There's no perfect solution to that one. But there are people that suggest you could use amendments, maybe to decrease the effects of salinity. We haven't seen very good results with some of those. We've done some greenhouse experiments, but that probably depends on context. Yes?
So you probably said this, but how big are the wells?
It really depends. The sites can be the reclamation. Oh, the restored pads?
Well, I'm just thinking, you did
Okay.
zero and then you did 50 and 100.
Oh.
So what is the size of the area that was replaced?
Okay, so actually we had the same transect size. So the reclamation area can be an acre to a few acres, but we actually did it, approximate from near that kind of leading edge of the reclamation. So we're not looking at the middle of the reclamation. We're talking about, what is a particular distance, consistent distance, I think 100 meters. I forget exactly what the distance was from the edge. And then from that edge, we're going out 50 meters. So we're actually entering the land, this 50 meters from the edge of the reclaimed pad. Yes?
Do you know if there's any projects to look at the higher trophic levels? The small mammal community might be responding to the changes that you're seeing.
There's people who've been interested, and when it first started, we did have people who are interested in birds, but we haven't been able to really match the spatial scales required with the level of sampling and the availability of sites. We haven't been able to reach a relevant spatial scale of sampling to ask those kinds of questions, but we are certainly open to them. Yes, Charlene.
Natalie, have you considered looking at the impact of your Retinol management on bats, on their abundance and diversity? Since they're highly effective.
Yeah, no, not yet. But if someone who studies bats wants to work with us, we would be happy to do that. Yeah, particularly as the kinds of insects that seem to be changing over would be particularly relevant for that group. Yeah, so I just saw an interesting Retinol present at the Tamarisk Retinol Coalition meeting. It was about fish using feeding on Retinol seeds and like increased fish levels actually. I hadn't thought about the insect fish portion. Yes, sir.
Are studies like these, your study, impact on current installations of wells? So their design, they certainly are different now,
Yeah.
I imagine, than they were in the 70s.
Yes.
Is this helping us
We're
have a better starting point?
We're hoping to. The hard part is we have a direct conduit through our collaboration with WPX Energy, and they do use our recommendations, but that is not always clear. How it's a little bit loose on how to really reach them. What we do, but our agency is our mission is to present the science in a technology transfer friendly form for that purpose. And hopefully it will be. And because many of the well sites that we're looking at are within the Little Missouri grasslands, so definitely within public lands, these kinds of studies can help when they're drawing up contracts for drilling what we expect to see over time. The other thing and that's an excellent question, because for a lot of these reclamations, especially the older ones, we have no idea what they planted. We have absolutely no idea, and they could be a variety of things. That's probably why there's so much question wheatgrass, frankly. Like that was something frequently planted. Right behind you, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, with soft rock mining, coal mining,
Uh-huh.
companies have to put up a bond
Mhm.
to successfully reclaim the site. Is that
Yeah.
the scenario?
Yes, yeah, and a lot of that is based, what I understand is on like plants per meter square, like what's considered an established site, basically. What kind of cover have you effectively put cover on? One thing I didn't say is that in these early reclamations, we actually do see range health is increasing through time, but the biotic integrity, it's actually weeds and plant community stuff that's actually the thing that persistently doesn't change, doesn't improve.
The
Yep.
salt issue,
Mhm.
so there are other salt issues, of course,
Mm.
irrigation.
Absolutely.
How does
Yeah.
how does this problem compare in scale to pheasant seed kinds of issues in the
That's an excellent question that I do not know a lot about, but there's a ag unit at Sydney that is asking this particular, like about saline seeps, because that is a major problem in these areas. And so I don't have a good answer for that. Yeah. You should check in on the Sydney Ag Side websites, because they might be able to tell you. So, great. Anything else? Thank you.